open up to 2 Samuel chapter 5. 2 Samuel chapter 5. We're going to deal with a few verses of this tonight, and we're going to look at some of the pictures that Steph and I were able to take while we were over in Israel. And my hope is that it won't just be pictures and you say, oh, that's something, but that it'll really help you to kind of picture what it is that we're looking at here in Scripture. By 2 Samuel chapter 5, David's patience and waiting upon the Lord has paid off. Ishbosheth, Saul's son, who had claimed the throne, is dead. And all 12 of the tribes send their elders to Hebron, where David became the second king of the United Kingdom of Israel. They came and they anointed him to be the king over not just the tribe of Judah, but over all of the tribes of Israel. Hebron is a city in Judah. It was formerly inhabited by the giant sons of Anak. If you remember a few weeks ago, I sang a special called I Want That Mountain, and it's from the book of Joshua talking about Caleb. When he was 85, he went and he said, look, I'm just as good now as I was 45 years ago. I want to go and accept what God has given me. And he went in and he kicked the giants out of Hebron, and that's where David was reigning from some hundreds of years later. So that's kind of the setting. Saul, if you remember, in 1 Samuel, Saul had used as his capital the city of Gibeah. That was his birthplace, and so it made sense for him to use that as his capital. If David were going to use his birthplace as his capital, where would he have his capital? Bethlehem, right? Jesse was in Bethlehem, and that's where David was when he came out of the hills from watching the sheep and was anointed. So if he had wanted to follow in Saul's footsteps and claim his hometown as his capital, he would have chosen Bethlehem, but he didn't. He chose Jerusalem. Jerusalem. Look at verse 6 here of 2 Samuel 5. It says, And the king and his men went to Jerusalem, unto the Jebusites, the inhabitants of the land, which spake unto David, saying, now this, if you can picture with me in your mind, I'm not going to do it for you, but if you remember the brat on the playground when you were in elementary school, the way they would talk when they were on the swing and you couldn't be, that's how they're talking right here. Very bratty. They say, Except thou take away the blind and the lame, thou shalt not come in hither, thinking, David cannot come in hither. So, Jerusalem, to get our bearings here a little bit, I'm going to show you some pictures here in just a few moments. Jerusalem lies within the tribal land of Judah. Okay? So, if you look here, this is a map of the 12 tribes, the areas that were inhabited by the 12 tribes. Judah is the southernmost, and within Judah, if you see that circle there, Simeon dwelt in some cities within Judah. They had a very sparse territory. But Judah owns, and Jerusalem is right on the border of Judah and where it meets up with the tribal territory of Benjamin. So that's where David is when he goes up. At this time in history, Jerusalem was not called Jerusalem, it was called Jebus, and it was not inhabited by Israelites. Rather, it was inhabited by Jebusites. You hear the name, and it makes sense. Jerusalem would be the subject of many battles through the Old Testament, but it was not in Jewish hands until the time of David. At the end of the message, I'm going to give you just a quick rundown as we make some application here this evening. But for all of the time, Joshua came in, led the children of Israel. They took over the land, but they didn't take over the city of Jerusalem. And it's kind of pivotal. It's right there in the middle. It's right in the middle, so if you have enemies, that's not where you want them. The enemies of Israel, the Jebusites, are right there present in their midst. Joshua chapter 15, verse 63 says, As for the Jebusites, the inhabitants of Jerusalem, the children of Judah could not drive them out. Now that doesn't sound right, does it? Do you think they could have driven them out? I think they could have. Why? Well, because God said, if you depend on me and you obey, I'll drive them out for you. But the people of Judah could not drive them out because they weren't trusting in God. They had backslidden. But the Jebusites dwell with the children of Judah at Jerusalem unto this day. Now God had foreseen this issue of having enemies in their midst. In Numbers 33:55, he said, this is God's promise to the children of Israel. Before they went in to clear out the land, God had said, but if ye will not drive out the inhabitants of the land from before you, then it shall come to pass that those which ye let remain of them shall be pricks in your eyes and thorns in your sides, and shall vex you in the land wherein ye dwell. And that's exactly what we're seeing here. You have a Jebusite stronghold right in the center of Israelite territory. And they're a prick in the side. They're not helping the children of Israel. The Jebusites were idolaters. They're not helping the children of Israel to walk with the Lord. They're a liability. And so David sets out to finish the work that had been begun in the days of Joshua. He says, I'm going to go. We're going to claim the city of Jerusalem, or Jebus. Well, the Jebusites heard that David was coming, and they felt secure. So secure that they sent him this taunting message here in verse 6. When they say, except thou take away the blind and the lame, thou shalt not come in hither. What that means is, this city, if you took out all of our warriors, if you took out all of our soldiers, this city could be defended by our handicapped population. That's how strong our defenses are. We're not worried about David. Now, you've read about David. You've read about David's mighty men. I would make the case that they perhaps should have considered what they were saying and who they were saying it to. But they felt very secure, so they were willing to run their mouth about how secure they were to David. And David is not going to take kindly to that. But let's talk a little bit about Jerusalem. Like I said, I want to give you a picture of it so that you can understand exactly what we're looking at. When you picture Jerusalem, you think of the modern city. You think of a city that looks something like this. This is what it looks like when we were there last month. This is taken from the Mount of Olives, looking across at the city of Jerusalem. Kind of the thing that lets you know that this is Jerusalem and not some other city is what? That gold dome right there, the Dome of the Rock. That's the third most holy Muslim site. And that mosque, and if you see right over here, there is another dome that's not gold. That's called the Al-Aqsa Mosque, and it is another holy site. Both of those mosques will need to move before the temple can be built, but it will be in very terrible times. If you look right here, along the wall that's right here, that gate that is solid across it, that's the eastern gate. Okay? The eastern gate on the eastern side of Jerusalem. Now, the Muslims bricked that up because they heard that the Messiah was going to try to enter through the eastern gate. And they think that those rocks are going to keep Christ from going through that wall, which is going to be great. I'm looking forward to watching. So that's the avenue onto the Temple Mount. If you look right down here in front, there's a cemetery. That's another Muslim thing that they did. They built cemeteries. There is a Muslim cemetery right there up against the wall. If you go into the valley, there's a Christian cemetery. And as you come up the Mount of Olives, there's a Jewish cemetery. Again, they're trying to keep the Muslims, when they built it up against the gate, their thought was, well, the Messiah won't cross over the graves to get into Jerusalem. So they think they're pulling a fast one on the Lord of life who can raise the dead. So, again, not going to work, but that's their thinking. And this is what we picture when we picture Jerusalem. Or perhaps you have in your mind something from the time of Christ. But when David came and took the city of Jerusalem, as we'll see this evening, it looked more like this. Obviously, we don't have a photograph, considerably smaller. As a matter of fact, what you see right here is not even on the last picture that we looked at. Okay? This picture right here is what it would have looked like when David came and took over. Y'all pray the lights stay on. As David came and took over the city of Jebus. Let me give you a little bit to help you here. This next picture is a picture of what it would have looked like under Solomon. This will help you get your bearings, okay? you see it's built up a little bit more. You see that new section there? That new section is the Temple Mount. Solomon, of course, was the one who built the temple. This map right here, this picture, north is that way. So if that helps you to kind of get your bearings, the eastern gate, that picture that I took and showed you just a moment ago, would have been taken from over here facing this direction, looking towards the west at the eastern side of Jerusalem. So we'll go back and we'll look at the city of David. Let me give you a little bit of information and kind of walk you through here a little bit on the city of David here.
Can you explain what the Temple Mount is? I'm dense.
Yes. Hold on just a second. The Temple Mount, can you see this laser pointer here?
Yeah.
It's not a laser pointer, but this right here is the Temple Mount. It would be the top of Mount Moriah. The top of Mount Moriah and also Mount Zion are right close there at those two. You have Mount Zion, Mount Moriah. The Temple Mount was a level place there that Solomon, they kind of made it a little bit more level and put in the temple complex there on that spot. But all of that was not there in the time of David. At the time of David, there was no Temple Mount. Rather, it looks like this. So let me give you just a quick rundown. Some of this will be familiar to you. Again, north is this way. Okay? So, on the eastern side, right here, you have the Kidron Valley. Okay? The Kidron Valley, and through the Kidron Valley runs the brook Kidron. Okay? Jesus crossed over the brook Kidron the night when he went out to pray in the garden. David will cross over the brook Kidron a little bit later. It's the way that you go. If you go from the Mount of Olives to Jerusalem, you go through the Kidron Valley if you're coming from the east. Down here on the bottom, you have the Valley of Hinnom. The Valley of Hinnom, in the days of Jesus, and even in the days of the kings following David, the Valley of Hinnom was the trash dump. When the Bible uses the expression Hades, it's usually the actual Hebrew word Hinnom. And the reason why is because it gave them a good picture of what it was. There was always smoke, stinking black smoke rising up out of Hinnom. So it gave a good picture of eternal hell. On the other side is a valley called the Tyropoeon Valley. Now I'm not going to go into great detail on this, but so Jerusalem exists in kind of a U of valleys. You have the Tyropoeon Valley. It's also called the Valley of Cheesemakers, if you're interested in the history of it. You go around the bottom and you have the Valley of Hinnom. And then as you go up on the eastern side, you have the Valley of Kidron. The Tyropoeon Valley was not very deep even in the days of David. And since then, if you go to Israel now, there is no Tyropoeon Valley. It was filled in by the civilizations that followed, and so there really isn't that valley there anymore. It was just kind of a dip in the ground. If you look here real quick to give you one more point, up here on the north, you have Mount Moriah. What happened on Mount Moriah? Think Genesis. That's where God told Abraham, take thy son, thine only son Isaac, and go to the mountains of Moriah, and there offer him as a burnt sacrifice. It would have been right here in this area. And if you keep going up the mountains of Moriah and you go up to the highest peak, you have Mount Zion, which is where we believe Calvary was, where the ultimate sacrifice for our sins. What Isaac pictured happened very likely in the same exact place. So look at verse 7 here. It says, so David comes, the Jebusites taunt him a little bit. They say, nevertheless, David took the stronghold of Zion. The same is the city of David. So David comes, and the Bible doesn't give us a ton of detail, especially here in 2 Samuel, but the next verse does describe the process by which David took this well-defended city. But in order to understand that, let me give you the importance of water. You remember hearing this when you were in school, how important it is that you drink water, right? Your mom told you this when you were little. It is important, and it's rare over in Israel. Israel is in an arid desert environment, so water is very, very precious. Because of this, settlements and cities usually take place around water. They take place around springs or brooks or some place where there is a source of fresh water so that it will sustain life. If you remember in reading through the book of Genesis, all the way back then, Abraham, when he first came to the promised land, he got into disputes with people over wells. If you remember, he got into some kind of heated words with Abimelech over the fact that he had dug a well, and Abimelech said, "No, I dug the well." And they had some conflict. Water matters in Israel. Cities will be built, and then massive cisterns are carved into the rock for the purpose of water storage, because it does not rain a whole lot. In the south, if you go down around the Dead Sea, they average 1 inch of rain a year. So it's pretty dry down there. When a walled city was built, it was very important to have access to water within the city walls. Why? Talk back to me. Why do you need it within the city walls?
So you can get it safely.
So you can get it safely in the event of a siege, right? If another army comes and they camp out around your city, and your water's over there on that other hilltop behind the enemy soldiers, your siege is going to last as long as your water supply lasts. And then when your water storage runs out, you have to give up, because you can't live but, I think they say, 3 days without water. In some cities, this problem was dealt with by digging tunnels far underground, and then they would go through rock. And eventually I'll show you some other pictures. It doesn't deal with what we are looking at this evening, but we crawled through some of those tunnels that go you walk underground for a long time to get to water in some of the cities. Other times, what they did, and this is what they did in the case of Jerusalem, the walls were constructed to enclose the water source, even if it had to go out of its way to do so. Let me show you here where the water source is. Okay, so remember, right here you have the Kidron Valley on the eastern side. Do you see this jut out over here? Why is that there? Well, right inside here there is a spring called the Spring of Gihon. That's where the water is. So Jerusalem's built up on a hill in a great place. But then they kind of had to build off to the east here and go down the hill a bit because they needed to get their water source enclosed. The water source is the Spring of Gihon. Now, if you wonder why I'm telling you all of this, it matters to what we're going to look at.
Is the water that surrounds that, is that salt water?
No, fresh water.
That surrounds the island?
It doesn't have water. Those valleys are empty, with the exception. There's a brook.
That's
Yeah.
not water.
Yeah, there's a brook down in the bottom of the Kidron Valley, but you could step across it on a good day. It's not a big thing. So the Kidron Valley has this spring, and over hundreds of years, this all has been built over with many layers of civilization. So if you want to look at what I showed you on that picture, you have to go underground to do it. And so we will go underground here in just a moment. But let me quickly give you David's plan of attack. Here's how it works. He says in verse 8, "And David said on that day, Whosoever getteth up to the gutter," what runs in a gutter? Water. "And smiteth the Jebusites, and the lame and the blind that are hated of David's soul, he shall be chief and captain. Wherefore they said that the blind and the lame shall not come into the house." Now David is a skilled tactician. David has been a man of war for at least the past 2 decades. He knows how to take a city. David knew that the weak point of Jebus, or Jerusalem, was the waterway that supplied the city. And so David put out word to his men. He said that whoever goes up the gutter and gets into the city and strikes first, he's going to be the commander-in-chief of my army. Who was the commander-in-chief of David's army right now? You remember his name? It's his nephew. His name is Joab. Okay? So David says, look, if you want Joab's job, go up in, strike the first blow to take Jerusalem. Now, when you read this in verse 8 and verse 9, you see this talking about the lame and the blind that are hated of David's soul. Here's what that was. David doesn't hate handicapped people. That's not what this is saying here at all. But it does kind of look like that when you look at it. Okay? What it is the Jebusites had taunted David. They said, look, we could defend this place with handicapped people. And so it turned into kind of a proverb in which all of David's enemies were referred to as handicapped people, because political correctness had not been invented at this point in the Old Testament. And so they were allowed to say stuff like that. And that's what's going on. So David gives this challenge to his men. They devise a plan. Joab, David's current commander, has already shown himself to be ambitious, and he doesn't want to lose his position. So 1 Chronicles 11:6, which is the parallel passage, tells us this. It says, "And David said, Whosoever smiteth the Jebusites first shall be chief and captain. So Joab, the son of Zeruiah, went first up and was chief." So he's the guy who made it in. Here's how he did it, okay? It's pretty neat. He led the way down the Kidron Valley. And following the brook runs north to south, as do most water sources. He's headed down, and he descends to where the brook comes to the wall there at Jerusalem, and it goes underground. There's a spring underground. It's fed from the spring. The Jebusites had built the city down, and then they had dug a cistern, and the cistern was kept full by the spring from the brook. So they have a seemingly unlimited water source of fresh water within their walls. They think they've got the tiger by the tail. So let me show you here on the map again. I'll show you kind of his plan of attack. So Joab comes from whatever direction to this point right here. Now he has to get into the water source. So he comes down through the brook Kidron, and he's going to have to go underwater. Now, what kind of scuba gear did they have access to back then? Yeah, hold your breath. Now, how about the lightweight armor that they had? Tell me about that. Yeah, they didn't have lightweight armor. Their armor was not made out of Kevlar. It was usually made out of bronze or steel or something that was fairly heavy. So here's how it looks. Let me take you and I'll show you some of the pictures. This is how you get to where this happened now. This is the tunnel that we walk through. You go down through rock, a long way down, on a very long staircase, and you just keep going down. All of this used to be above ground. But now, because of civilizations that have come and built over and built over and built over, you have to go underground to get to what we're talking about here in 2 Samuel. When you get all the way to the bottom, you find what we're talking about. Here is the cistern that Joab came into. Okay? They have it lighted blue. If you look down here, you see where it's kind of flat and shiny. That's the water. It's still wet down there. There's still water coming up out of the spring. So, if you see where it's kind of carved through there, you see the door right to the side? So that was all underwater. All underwater. So Joab comes in underwater. Tell me about their flashlight situation. They use torches, right? How do torches work underwater? Not great. So he's doing all of this blindly. So my respect for the physical specimen of Joab goes up when I was here. Okay? He comes in underwater and he makes his way to a pool. Now Joab and his men began their swim under the wall into the pool area, which at that time would have been underwater, working his way up to the access shaft. He works his way all the way up. Let me show you here real quick. If you're standing there and you're looking at the blue spot that we just looked at a minute ago, if you were to turn and you were to look, this picture is looking towards the west. Okay? How I showed you on that picture, how the city kind of ran down to the east. This is looking up. These are the rocks that used to be the city of Jebus. So you look up at this. Down here at the bottom, there is a cistern. So this right here, what we're looking up, is looking up the slope of the mountain. Everybody follow me there? Okay. So Joab comes into this pool, and then he makes his way to what has been called Warren Shaft. Now this doesn't look very impressive in a picture, but it's 13 meters through solid rock. 13 meters is 42.5 feet. So Standard telephone poles, what, 40 foot? So quite the impressive thing when you remember that about half of this was underwater. So Joab swims underwater through a cistern, up through the gutter, up to this shaft, comes up. When he comes up, the water didn't go all the way to the top. He has to work his way up this shaft. So he works his way up the shaft. This would have been a guarded position within the city, the water source. So Joab, as he works his way up the shaft, would also have to be fighting people off as his men are working their way up under him. Joab leads his men all the way up. They fight their way in and they overcome the city of Jebus by coming up that little hole in the ground right there. Any questions on that before we move on here? Pretty neat when you see a little bit of kind of where it was.
Did he know how that was laid out, or did he just have to learn it as he went?
We would have no reason to assume that Joab had ever done it. I would think that perhaps they had some sort of a spy type of a situation where they can say, look, there's a shaft that goes down, the cistern comes out, you can get in. He would have been a fool to go in there not knowing that it came out anywhere. So, but to do that in the dark with armor on would have been something. When we left this, I told staff, I said, this is why Joab's men called him Sir, because of his doing this. So let's talk about David's capital here. David takes the city, and that's really all that we have recorded for us. David takes the city. Look at verse 9. So David dwelt in the fort, and called it the city of David, and David built round about from Milo and inward. Much of the city of David that David would have lived in is under the modern city of Jerusalem, and it would be many yards under the modern city of Jerusalem. But archaeologists have uncovered a portion, so I'll show you around just a little bit of the city of David that we were able to see. As you walk up, we were there and right at the kind of the peak flower time, so lots and lots of flowers and colors as you come to the city of David. So this right here, you remember the hill that we were talking about that goes down towards the Mount of Olives? This is looking down the hill. All of these rocks over here, that's the city of David. Those are the houses that would have been there in David's time. They've uncovered them. They were covered over with centuries and civilizations. But you can walk down toward this. As you walk down this side, you're walking down into the Kidron Valley. Let me show you here. This is what it looks like right across from what we were just looking at. If you look across, you can see this is the Palestinian city of Silwan. This is where many of the most feared and terrible terrorists who are among the Palestinians, they come out of this town. This is kind of the hometown of the other team there in Israel. But that's right across. So the city of David would be where I'm standing in this picture, looking across the Kidron Valley at the other hillside there, which would be part of the Mount of Olives. This right here is looking up the Kidron Valley. So the picture that I just took, we're looking across to the east, and then I turn and look to the north. This is up the Kidron Valley. That right there, where you see all of the, looks like concrete, that's the biggest Jewish graveyard on planet Earth, and it covers the side of the Mount of Olives. So Jesus rose back to heaven right there from the top of the Mount of Olives. So that's the Mount of Olives, and then on this side you go up, and the Kidron Valley runs right in between. The brook Kidron runs right down through the middle. And that neighborhood that we just looked at, where the Palestinians are from, you can see just starting over here on this side. Let me show you again just a little bit. So where we're standing when I'm taking those pictures is right here, approximately. So looking this direction, and you can look up the Kidron Valley to the north, or look across to the Mount of Olives in the east. Show you a few more of the buildings that are there. This is what it looks like now when you go. Obviously, the buildings haven't been completely reconstructed, but you can see very definitely the walls that are there, the hallways, the houses. They'd have loved your house. Doesn't matter which house you live in, but they'd have loved it and thought it was massive because they live in very small, we would call them apartments, or we would call them very tiny closets even, but that would have been where they lived. Here's a kind of a backed up picture a little bit. This is the city of David, that part that rides up the hill there. Where Joab would have come in would be behind us and down the hill. But you can see the walls. This man here in the red shirt was our guide at the time that we were there. His name was Shimon, very knowledgeable about a lot of things. But you can see going up the hillside, you see the structures that are there. Let me show you something that he pointed out to us. We think of this time, this would have been thousands of years ago, we think of it as fairly primitive. Check this out. This is indoor plumbing. In reality, it is. You see the rock with the hole in it, and then if you'll notice right under that, they have it conduct so that it will conduct waste away. And so they had indoor plumbing in the city of David. Now, primitive, I'll grant you, but considerably more than we would think of for this period in time. The Jews often had things like this, very innovative when it came to cleanliness. Why? They lived in close quarters. You know why else? Because God told them to be clean. If you read the law, you'll find repeated instructions that God gave the Jewish people for the care of their bodies, for the cleanliness of their bodies. God knew what he was talking about. This is looking to the north. This is looking to the north, just past what we were talking about, the city of David as it exists. Now, the new city of Jerusalem, where you can go and you can walk and buy an ice cream, is just on the other side here. And then the city of David continues on down below it, but it's not uncovered, nor is it likely to be. Part of this, now if you look on this picture, you see where all those flowers are up on the top? Right up above there, we find David's palace, which is described for us here in verse 10. It says, "And David went on and grew great. And the Lord God of hosts was with him." This was that secret. This is the secret of David's success, that God is with him, right? God is with him. "And Hiram, king of Tyre, sent messengers to David, and cedar trees, and carpenters, and masons." We saw the handiwork of some of those masons just a moment ago. "And they built David an house. And David perceived that the Lord had established him king over Israel, and that he had exalted his kingdom for his people Israel's sake." This was recently uncovered, but really neat to see while we were there. They found David's palace. On top of the hill, they have it. It's underneath a cover, because they don't want the elements to wear away at it. But this is David's palace. You can see the walls there that were constructed. And maybe you look at this and you say, well, how can they know that this was a palace? Because these rock walls look just like the rock walls outside, don't they? That's what I was telling you this morning. I'll show you why we know it was his palace in just a moment. A few more. These are some of the rooms that were within David's palace. It's a very large structure. Here's one of the ways we know this was a palace. It has cisterns in it. The only place where they would have cisterns would be in temples or in palaces. Did David have a temple? No. David had the tabernacle. The temple was built by his son Solomon further up the hill. This is David's palace. One more thing that they found that just kind of cemented it, they found the top of David's pillars. So if you were to go to David's palace, you see the pillar that's on the wall. That would be called the capital of the pillar, where you see the intricate carving and design. So much so that Israel, this right here, the coin that I have on the corner, that's Israel's 5 shekel piece, which would be about the equivalent of $1.50 in our money. They took David's capital, the capital of his pillars, put it on their currency, just as a sign of national pride. So that kind of brings us, you get an idea of David's city. I hope it kind of gives you a little bit more of the color. It'd be a lot better if we could all just go over there and we'll look at it sometime. We'll work that out one of these days. But that's the city of David as it exists right now. If you go all the way to the bottom of the city of David in the time of Jesus, down at the bottom, they had re-navigated the Gihon spring and it came up in the pool of Siloam. which is where Jesus performed miracles down there at the Pool of Siloam. You remember he sent a man with blind eyes, he sent him to Siloam to wash the clay out of his eyes. That's where that happened. Let me quickly give you just this last portion. It's just David's family tree. David's family tree keeps growing, which is a problem given the way he's doing it. Look at verse 13. And David took him more concubines and wives out of Jerusalem after he was come from Hebron. And there were yet sons and daughters born to David. And these be the names of those that were born unto him in Jerusalem: Shemua, Shobab, Nathan, and Solomon, Ibhar also, and Elishua, Nepheg, Japhia, Elishama, Eliada, and Eliphalet. Now, this verse is giving us future information about David. 4 of those names, Shemua, Shobab, Nathan, and Solomon, were children that David had with Bathsheba. David's not married to Bathsheba yet, so this is just telling us this happened while he was at Jerusalem. And then the other youngins that he had here, we don't know who their mother was. Very likely the concubines. I think it's kind of funny, a little bit offensive, especially given my condition. It says, and daughters. We have no idea how many daughters the man had. He had lots and lots of children. By the way, nobody's family tree should be this confusing. And the problem is, he went against God's law. He went against what God would have had him to do, and the Bible faithfully records this, mentions the sons of the concubines, and such. So we'll look at that, and this will come back, and we'll walk through this family tree as we get to it. Now, maybe you're sitting there and you're wondering, how on earth are we going to get any application out of this? Let me give you just a quick thought. I know we're at time, but listen to this just briefly. We've looked at Jerusalem a good bit this evening. Jerusalem has been under many rulers throughout time. If you look just at Bible history alone, you find a good number of rulers. In Genesis 14, Abraham came and met the king of Salem, Jerusalem. His name was Melchizedek. Melchizedek was the king of Salem. He was also the priest of the Most High God. Melchizedek used to be under godly control in Genesis 14. But while the Israelites were in Egypt, Jerusalem fell into the hands of the Jebusites, and it went from being called Salem to being called Jebus. Following the conquest of the land under Joshua, Jerusalem was one of the holdouts. It was a bastion of Canaanite power, right in the middle of Israel. That's a problem, as we've seen. David took the city, and it would be under Jewish control until the Babylonian captivity in 586, after the kingdom had divided, right there towards the end. The Jews returned from captivity, and the city came back into Jewish control during the time of Christ. It was under Jewish control with a Roman governor. Remember, his name was Pontius Pilate at the time of Christ. And in 70 AD, the Romans came to Jerusalem. They massacred the Jews, destroyed the temple, and expelled all of the Jews who survived. And from 70 AD until 1967, some of you might remember, in 1967, Jerusalem came back under Jewish control, the whole city. Prior to that, there had been portions under Jewish control, but not from 70 AD until 1967. It was not in Jewish hands. Here's the application. Here's the application that I want you to get from this tonight. As we think about Jerusalem, yesterday's victories are not sufficient for today. David had Jerusalem. He made it his capital. It was a place where Jews could walk with their head held high. Solomon made Jerusalem a beautiful, magnificent city with the temple of Jehovah on the hilltop. But those victories didn't do any good for Israel after they let the enemies of God back into the land. Similarly, our adversary is not going to allow us to claim spiritual victory and then rest. Just like the Jews, if the Jews want to maintain Jerusalem, you have to maintain a watch. You have to maintain a guard because there's somebody who's going to come and try to take it. The Jews found this out. In our lives, we're not defending a city. We're defending the spiritual ground that we've got. We're defending those spiritual steps that spiritual ground that's gained has to be maintained through vigilance and constant readiness. Let me close with this verse. 1 Thessalonians 5, verse 5. This is Paul, and he's giving us counsel. You want to maintain your spiritual liberty. You want to maintain victory. You want to maintain the ground that you've gained. Ye are all the children of light, and the children of the day. We are not of the night nor of darkness. Therefore let us not sleep as do others, but let us watch and be sober. Israel wouldn't have lost. They wouldn't have lost their capital if they'd have kept their guard up. We won't lose our spiritual ground if we keep ours up. Any questions that you have on what we've looked at here tonight? We've covered a lot of ground. Hope that it's been helpful to you. Any questions before we go? Yes, sir.
Not a question, go back to the part about your water. Speaking of God's power, today on the Rosenberg report, in one of the driest places in the world, their technology is so good now that they are looking to export water to surrounding countries.
Yes, yes. Israel has become a net exporter of water. pretty awesome. Yeah. Very neat. If you go to Israel, there are trees everywhere. Prior to 1948, there were trees almost nowhere. The Jews, when they got there, started planting trees like mad, and they planted literally millions of trees all over the hillsides. When you ride through the Jezreel Valley or through Megiddo, you'll see trees everywhere. The Jews are just planting trees like crazy, and they grow because the Jews have irrigated, and it's pretty neat to see. Anyone else? Thoughts, questions, comments? All right. If you've got comments or questions, I'd love to talk with you. I've got more pictures. I haven't shown you all that we took. I've got videos too if you're interested in that. But we'll show you more as we move along and we come to it. Let's bow for a word of prayer. Our Father in heaven, we thank you for this day. Lord, we thank you for your word and for the accuracy of it. Lord, I pray that tonight has been helpful. I pray that it would help to bring your word to life. We would understand that it's not a story along the lines of a fairy tale, but Lord, that it's an account of history. And I pray that we would understand it as such and that we would learn the lessons. Lord, I pray that as Israel lost their capital through laxity and laziness and not being watchful, Lord, that we would not lose the ground that we've gained spiritually in the same way. Pray that we would walk closely with you. Thank you for your goodness to us. Lord, I thank you for each and every one who's here tonight. I pray that you keep us safe as we go our separate ways. I pray that you bring us back at the next appointed time. In Jesus' name.